These are some of the most horrific facts in all of human history. And trust me, this video is a long one because there is so much to talk about here. So where do we get started? Well, how about during the war times? One of the craziest tricks used in war at the time was when Persians used hundreds of cats to defeat the world's strongest army. You see, cats were considered as sacred in Egypt, which meant that if you hurt or killed a cat there, they would literally kill you over it. And that's exactly how the Persians were planning to win the war that they had with Egypt at the time. They had captured hundreds, if not thousands of cats, and when the battle between the two countries started, the Persians released all the cats into the battlefield like they were some kind of Pokemon army. And funnily enough, it actually worked. Soldiers were left confused and in chaos because they didn't want to hurt the cats. And those few who did were going to face an even bigger challenge coming up. This is because not only did the Persians dump the cats into the battlefield, they even strapped the cats to their shields and armor in hopes that the Egyptians would be scared to even hit the cats. And the stupid part is it worked. And this made them win the entire war, meaning Egypt was now under Persian control. And I know, that sounds insane. But here's an even more insane question for you. Have you ever tried to shoot someone with one of those laser pens in class? Well, turns out that's a war crime. In fact, laser weapons are so inhumane that they were banned from ever being used in combat. This is because there was no way to avoid an attack from a laser which would leave any soldier completely blinded, making them useless in war and permanently disabled. A high energy laser would be used to capture the soldier's attention before a second laser blinded everyone staring in its direction. Once hit with the laser, the soldiers would be disoriented, meaning they could easily walk into enemy fire or step on a landmine. The danger also comes from the fact that it doesn't take much to be blinded by a laser, meaning you could easily blind thousands of troops in a single strike, and you could easily overtake an enemy overnight. But even if you somehow managed to avoid turning into that block of Swiss cheese after being hit by the laser, your life would never be the same again. You would actually require assistance, and you would never be able to see your loved ones again. But those problems would only multiply if you were in contact with the phosgene gas. See, phosgene gas was one of the most insane and deadly things you could encounter on a battlefield, and many soldiers were terrified to come in contact with it. The gas is deadly for a bunch of reasons, including the fact that it has no smell or color, meaning it's completely undetectable. If a soldier breathes in this gas, they would have to start experiencing some extreme burning in the throat and eyes, since the gas literally just destroys your lungs. But by the time that this has started happening, it would already be too late to save you. And after this, you begin to vomit, and soon after you just keel over and die. If you were unfortunate enough to survive this, your skin would start peeling off as if you were severely burned anyway. Contact with the phosgene gas is always fatal, and it could take hours for troops to detect the usage of gas because of its lack of smell and color. That's why the soldiers were instructed to wear gas masks at the time, which caused soldiers to be even more stressed and scared about the trenches in general. They developed the gas in several ways, but most commonly they were shot at with artillery weapons somehow, and that was mainly because the shells would break open on impact. But sometimes they were also placed in an open field if the wind was blowing in the right direction. I know that sounds quite explosive or whatever, but it's kind of like how explosive the taste of Spam is. Now, I know what you're thinking. What? How the fuck does a can of Spam fit into this list? Well, did you know that they turned Spam, the meat, into a war crime? You see, during the later years of the First World War, the Germans were starting to run out of food, which is why the Canadians were thinking of great ways to abuse this, and one idea that they came up with was so insane that doing so is now a war crime. They would start throwing cans of Spam into the German trenches, and while they were scared at first, over time they would start to actually eat the Spam. They also started trusting whoever was throwing the cans of the Spam, usually gathering in areas around the group, and they just start begging for more. And at one point, it was like half the trench would come to see what was going on because there was literal to no food going around at the time. But the Canadians didn't actually want to help out the Germans, of course. So when they knew their trust was won, they started turning the Spam cans into grenades. And as corny as it sounds, they had an explosive taste. So the next time they threw the cans into the trench, they would explode whenever they were picked up. And with this, they were able to wipe out entire trenches with these one single can of Spam. This tactic made the German soldiers feel hopeless since they lost a little bit of food they had, and it made them a lot angrier at the Canadians for doing such a horrible thing. And it's safe to say that this tactic is absolutely crazy, and it's no wonder that it became a war crime after the First World War. And I know, Spam tastes horrifically poisonous, but some of the biological forts were way more poisonous. You see, biological warfare is even more deadly and inhumane than chemical warfare, since it can wipe out entire cities of people if it's used on them. And a really popular example of biological warfare is from the smallpox blankets. It's exactly what it sounds like, blankets on other pieces of clothing, and they're just infected with smallpox. And this is usually done to weaken a fortress of armies. It was either done by launching the blankets into enemy territories using cannons, or by handing it to the enemy officers disguised as a gift. It would have roughly the same effect as sneezing on an unvaccinated kid, since it would leave them completely sick or sometimes even dead. The funniest part is that it actually worked. For example, Fort Pitt in 1763. It was a conflict between Native American tribes and the British, who owned Fort Pitt for the most of the time. The fort was stormed by the Americans and they were getting dangerously close to it, so the British had to think of ways to keep them out without stabbing them by hand, which is where they came up with the idea of smallpox. The plan was to hand out Indian blankets and handkerchiefs borrowed from smallpox hospitals during peace negotiations in order to weaken the army, and it actually worked. The British managed to defeat the fort, and the Indians now had a whole different problem to deal with, kind of like a bigger problem like kamikaze was. You see, most people already know about kamikaze planes that crashed into allied boats, but did you know there's a whole different group of kamikaze stretching so far that they would even make literal human anti-ship mines that just sat at the bottom of the ocean? And I know, it sounds very weird, but these three groups of kamikaze will actually terrify you. Take for example the lunge mines. This was just a long stick with a mine slapped on top of it, with the entire purpose for the mine to have a soldier just run up to a tank, remove the safety pin, and just throw yourself at an enemy tank like it's no tomorrow. Well, that's probably because there would be no tomorrow, but that's because in most cases the person holding the mine on the stick would instantly die from the explosion. And what's worse is it wouldn't even fully take out the tank, it would just make an opening in the side of it or something. This technique was often used during the Second World War, but things got a lot more extreme when the Japanese realized that the ocean also exists. We're missing out on an entire market of suicide bombers here. I mean, look, there's a perfectly good ocean we can use. And just like that, the suicide divers were born. These guys' jobs were literally to suit up in a diving kit, grab a mine on a piece of bamboo, and get to work. They would usually sit in water for up to 10 hours waiting for an enemy ship to arrive. And once they did, well, they'd just point the stick at the hull of a ship and wait for it to crash into it. The Japanese bought like 8,000 of these suits, but only 1,200 or so soldiers were trained enough to actually use them. Though I don't see how it takes much training to poke a stick at a boat, but it might be me. This technique was kind of successful as they managed to damage several US ships during the invasion of Japan, but luckily they didn't cost nearly as much as the next form of kamikaze. And before we continue, I just want to say, could you please subscribe? It means so much, and since you're already watching this far into the video, it means you like it most likely. So if you enjoyed, please subscribe. Kaizen were small torpedoes operated by people on board, filled with explosives that were designed to crash into enemy ships. If you were on the right course to hit an enemy ship, you would lock controls and wait for the right moment to explode it. Most of the times these attacks wouldn't work since the ship would be gone by the time the submarine got to it. And total over 500 of these things were made, but only like 1 or 2 times where they actually worked and took ships down. So you can imagine hearing that you'd be assigned to get inside a torpedo and crash yourself into an enemy ship. I'd be terrified. Kind of like how terrified I would be if I was dead and a military captain at the same time? What? How does that work? I know, it just sounds weird, but not many people have changed the course of World War after months of dying. But one dead homeless guy actually somehow led the Allies to win the Second World War without even being alive, or even being involved at all. During World War II, the Allies desperately needed to win an upcoming invasion of Sicily, but they knew that the Germans were defending that area really well, which is why they came up with the idea to gaslight the Nazis into thinking they were invading Greece and Sardinia. Now, obviously this is a really difficult thing to do, as the Germans are surely smart enough to see enough through lies of the Allies, so obviously they needed an insanely good plan. And they came up with a plan that was very simple, but required a lot of luck to pull off. The first step of the plan was to find a body that they could drop in the Germans. Lucky for them, they found a homeless guy called Gillander, who was found off the street after chugging some rat poison. Now it was time to turn good old Gillander into one of the most esteemed majors that the army had to offer. The goal is to strap some fake invasion plans to Gillen's body and ditch him somewhere in the sea, with the hopes that he would be found by the Germans on the beach, so they had all the fake plans. So they tossed Gillen, now the Major of the Royal Marines, into the ocean right outside Spain, complete with fake photos of his family, some letters to his father, and some fake invasion plans. And luckily, the Germans found those plans, and the Allies acted like they really wanted those documents back, since they were very classified. But the Germans said, "Finders keepers," and actually sent a huge part of their army to defend Greece and Sardinia, leaving Sicily completely free for the Allies to just take over. And securing Sicily was really important for the invasion of Italy and Europe, so it's crazy to think about how it would have actually gone without our beloved Gillander. Such a valiant soldier. Gone too soon. But what I'm about to tell you is even crazier. Did you know that people with OCD had a higher chance of dying during the Second World War? I know, it sounds stupid, but the Germans left a bunch of really weird random traps around, like for example, a crooked painting. Yep, a painting. They would intentionally tilt paintings and make it so if soldiers tried to correct them, they would instantly be blown up by explosives. And it wasn't just paintings they turned to explosives. The British literally turned rats into walking, ticking time bombs. They did this because the Germans always used to burn rats in their ovens in order to prevent diseases from spreading. But if the suicide bomber rats were chucked into the furnace, it would cause them to explode and destroy everything around them. Never thought suicide rats would be a thing. But what Dennis Delmer did was way worse. You see, not many people have convinced an entire troop of enemy soldiers to fake being sick in order to not have to go to war. But Dennis, he somehow did. Dennis Delmer's tactics are so funny that he deserves his own spot in this list. You see, Dennis was someone that made propaganda during World War II, and he did quite a lot of other stuff. Like for example, making food stamps that were even higher quality than the actual ones, which made the real thing look like counterfeits. But his greatest work is probably how he convinced thousands of soldiers to fake illness to make Germany lose battles. Dennis would make books of instructions of how to fake illness and spread them as deep into Germany as he possibly could, to convince the German troops to possibly not fight for their country. And he said it would be a win-win situation if they did have to fight, since officers now wouldn't believe that people were actually sick, which also meant that real sick soldiers would actually be sent back to fight, which would mean entire troops of soldiers somehow got sick and couldn't fight. No sick days, I guess, but it would be made way worse if you had to fight a bunch of balloons like a birthday party. Yeah, I'm not even joking either. You see, during World War II, the Allies wanted to convince the Germans that D-Day was happening at a different point. They did this by setting up an entire army of fake inflatable planes, tanks, trucks, and even a full outpost of communications giving fake orders to troops in hopes that the Germans would believe the lies. The trick worked so well that the Germans kept troops at the fake invasion site for weeks, even while the Normandy invasion was happening at the same time. This trick is still being used today, like for example in Ukraine at the moment, where they've even put heat generators in to give the fake tanks a correct heat signature. But enough about war, let's talk about some hostage situations here. These are some of the craziest hostage situations in human history, starting with a crazy real story at the Olympics and getting more insane as we go. Our first situation started all the way back during this 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, where 8 members of the Palestinian military organization called Black September wanted to cause chaos and death where possible. The group climbed a 6-foot barbed wire fence carrying duffel bags full of rifles, grenades, and gas bombs, all without making any noise. Once inside, the group used stolen keys to enter an apartment of 2 of the Olympic athletes. One of the people in the room heard the scratching sound on the door, so he began to investigate. But once he was closer, the door swung open and he was face to face with the armed hostage takers. He quickly threw massive weight at the door in an attempt to close it, which gave his roommates time to escape through the window. The terrorists then shot the man in the jaw and forced him to reveal the location of the other Olympians. The man called Moshe Weinberg led the intruders past apartment 2, leading them to the apartment that didn't have any Israelis in it. Instead, he brought them to apartment 3, which was full of wrestlers and weightlifters. Moshe hoped that the strong athletes had a better chance of fighting the intruders, but unfortunately for him, they were all sleeping, which allowed the hostage takers to capture the athletes. The hostage takers then forced the athletes to go back to the coach's apartment, but on the way, Moshe attacked one of the gunmen, allowing one of the wrestlers to escape to the underground parking garage. Moshe knocked one of the intruders unconscious and slashed one of the others with a fruit knife that he found. But unfortunately, before he did any serious damage, they shot him in the head. Another wrestler also tried attacking the gunman, but was also shot and killed though. They then tied all the remaining athletes up in the coach's apartment and threw the bullet-filled corpses of their friends at their feet as a warning. Most of the athletes were also beat up to the point where they had broken bones, so they had no chance of fighting back. And after taking them hostage, the terrorists told the police their demands. They demanded the release of a lot of Palestinian and non-Arab prisoners who were held in Israel, as well as West German imprisoned founders of the Red Army faction, which was a far-left group in Germany. In total, the list had 328 names on it, and the second Israel heard the demands, they instantly denied it. The hostage takers then threw the body of Coach Moshe in the hallway to show that they're not messing around. The terrorists held the apartment full for 12 hours after that, which meant that the Olympic Games just kept going on like nothing was happening. Athletes were walking around, not knowing what was going on just a few feet away from them. At 5:51 a.m., the local police and emergency services were contacted. The government decided that instead of using the special forces who were trained in missions like these, to instead use the local police. And this would be a massive mistake from their end. While the plans were being made, a psychopath with a gun in the apartment kept telling his leader to kill the hostages, but the leader kept denying him, telling him to wait 5 more minutes. The German police only expected 3 gunmen to be in the apartment, instead of the 8 that were actually there, which would later turn out to be a massive mistake. The police sent a few officers who ended up being disguised in awkward Olympic outfits with bulletproof vests, and they were launched in a rescue operation. The plan was for them to crawl through vents and kill the gunmen inside, hopefully without losing anyone. But instead, due to all the cameras and media that were around the village, the hostage takers spotted the mission on TV and threatened to kill 2 of the hostages. This made the police give up on the mission to prevent a bloodbath. The terrorists then demanded a safe passage with the hostages onto a plane to Cairo by 9 PM, and for the police to instantly leave. The German officials were allowed to talk to the hostages, and by 8:30, an agreement was made. The hostage takers and their hostages were flown to a nearby airport, while the police was coming up with a second plan to rescue them. The police realized that there was a 200-meter long walk from the apartments to the helicopters, which they were planning to use to ambush the terrorists. But one of the main terrorists, called Isa, insisted on checking the route first. So he and a few of the hostages slowly made their way to the helicopter, while snipers were looking at them and a few police officers were laying right above their heads, ready to shoot them the second they spotted them. Isa slowly started walking over, and the police nervously waited for him to cross. But while Isa was slowly walking towards the helicopter, the police snipers had to crawl away in order to not be spotted, which turned out to be a massive mistake. Isa heard the crawling and instantly ran back inside with the hostages. This time, he demanded a bus brings them to the helicopter though. Their plan had just failed. But luckily, the terrorists didn't kill any hostages out of rage. After a close call, the group of hostages and terrorists were brought to the airfield, where the German police had set up officers in sniper positions around the airfield. I don't know why, but none of the officers had any sort of sniper training or any special weapons. They were just straight up just using normal weapons. The first plan was to have officers disguise themselves as flight crew, but at first they were denied from entering the airbase, which I mean, come on guys, this is starting to look bad for you. But when the lead officer was told about the idea, he rejected it, saying the terrorists would never fall for it. In total, the police tried to rescue the athletes a few more times, all ending in failure due to the stupid things like the armored personnel vehicles being stuck in traffic. But when the armored personnel carriers did arrive, the kidnappers were starting to become scared, fearing the plan might actually fail. At exactly 4 minutes past midnight on September 6th, one of the terrorists turned on a hostage in one of the 2 helicopters and fired at them with an AK from point blank range. 3 athletes were instantly killed from this and 1 was seriously wounded. The terrorist then pulled a pin on a hand grenade and threw it into the cockpit, causing the whole thing to blow up and completely destroy anyone still inside. He then sprinted across the tarmac and began firing at the police, who killed him with return fire. Another terrorist, Khalid Jawad, attempted to escape, but he was gunned down by one of the snipers. What happened to the rest of the hostages is still up to debate, as some reports say the police shot and killed the remaining hostages out of confusion, and some reports also say the terrorists did. The rest of the terrorists were also killed after a long fight, and around 1:30 AM the whole thing was finally over. And luckily only a few small lives were lost in this situation. But as the video goes on, you'll notice the stakes behind these hostage situations will only get crazier. Like for example in the next one, where over 100 children and adults were taken hostage because of the Dutch government. But before I continue, I'd like to ask if you could subscribe. It means so much, and the fact you watched this far into the video means you probably liked it by this point, so click the button. Imagine it's a normal morning. You take a train to work, but out of nowhere, the emergency brakes hit and you come crashing to a stop. You look around confused for a second before 9 men armed with guns board the train. You've just been taken hostage, and they're threatening to blow up this train as well as a middle school with 100 children if you don't listen to them. The hostage situation started when terrorists boarded a train and threatened the lives of the driver and mechanic to leave the vehicle. The armored terrorists then began selecting passengers at random, gathering a group of around 40 of them. Those lucky few were instructed to leave the train, but over 54 were still left inside. Those still on the train were forced to help the hijackers barricade the doors and cover up windows, obviously so the special forces couldn't see inside. While people were working on the barricades, warning shots were fired into the cabin by the terrorists to scare those inside. And at the same time, 4 armed terrorists took 105 children and 5 teachers hostage at a nearby middle school, threatening to blow up the whole school if the government didn't listen to their demands. The hijackers wanted the Dutch government to release 21 prisoners who were involved with previous attacks, a way to talk to the terrorists at school, and also for the Dutch government to raise awareness about the situation in their homeland. And if they failed to meet those demands, that both the school and the train would be blown up. The deadline for the demands slowly approached as everyone on the train was nervous, while the hijackers were waiting for the negotiators to arrive. The Dutch government was not planning on agreeing to the demands of the hijackers, since they assumed it was all a bluff. If they're wrong about this, it can mean that hundreds of innocent children and people would be killed because of one mistake. At this point, the hijacking had been going on for over a day, and people were starting to get tired. But when the deadline approached, then the government was given one final warning to step in and meet the demands. They didn't. Everyone waited nervously when the deadline was coming near, but the special forces were still very busy gathering information about the hostage situation. They knew that over 50 people were still on board, as well as 9 hijackers. The passengers were split up into 2 cabins, one for the men and one for the women. 4 of the hijackers were located at the front of the train, one in between the male and female cabins, and the rest behind the hostages. But this information wouldn't be of much use if they didn't follow through with their threats. And when the last minute passed, nothing happened. Instead, the hijackers gave a new set of demands. This time, they wanted the plane to be prepared with enough fuel to make it to the country of their choice. If the Dutch government didn't comply, everyone in the train would be shot dead. The government still had no intentions to listen to the hijackers, which was starting to piss them off. So to show how serious the hijackers were, one of the armed terrorists grabbed 3 pieces of rope, a bunch of blindfolds, and went into the passenger's cabin. Special forces were terrified of what he might do, so when they saw him making nooses, they were terrified. The passengers were blindfolded and the nooses were placed around their necks. Passengers were then dragged outside the train, and the special forces were warned that things could go really south if they didn't listen to them. The screaming fears of the passengers finally started talks of negotiation on the 31st of May, almost a week after the incident had started. The hijackers wanted negotiators to be sent to the train so they could talk face to face, and after many discussions, the crisis team sent 2 members of the Dutch Moluccani community to go meet with them. Finally, progress seemed to be made after over 10 days of terror, which is when one of the terrorists again went into the passenger cabin with no warning. No one knew if the negotiators had upset the terrorists or what they had been planning on doing. So when he dragged out 2 pregnant women, everyone was shocked. But to their shock, he let them go. They had just shown a sign of good faith, which relieved everyone in the country. Although the hijackers were unaware of the fact that the special forces had secretly planted listening devices in the food and water that was going into the train, so they could listen on every single conversation the hijackers were having. And this is how they knew when to comply with their requests and when to hold their ground. They knew exactly when their lives of the people on board were in danger and when they were bluffing. And after 10 days of terror, and after the negotiations had become completely useless, they were ready to make an end of the situation. With the previously collected information, the government had set up a plan to kill hostage takers on board the train. The idea was to have fighter jets fly over and shock all the hostages and make sure they didn't cause any extra chaos. Then snipers would take out terrorists, after which the special forces would board the train. The plan was put into action on the morning of June 11th, where snipers fired into the front of the train, heavily wounding 2 hostage takers, killing 1 and leaving 1 completely fine. 3 snipers then fired into the middle of the train where 2 hostage takers were supposed to be, but instead the terrorists swapped themselves with hostages that night before, so unfortunately 1 woman was killed instantly and 1 was wounded. At the back of the train, most of the hijackers were killed by the sniper fire, but this meant that there were living hijackers on the train that were now blending in with the crowd. After the snipers were done firing, Marines set board on the train, where they placed explosives on the door to break in, which failed to explode for the first team of Marines. They instead crawled in through the windows and found no one in the last part of the train, like expected. The second group of Marines blew open the doors to the second compartment of the train and unexpectedly encountered a hostage taker. They quickly killed her, turned around and started clearing the other side of the train. The last group of Marines went into the front of the train and encountered 4 hostage takers, 2 of which were already dead and other 2 surrendered without a fight, partially because they had already been shot by snipers. In total, 6 of the hostage takers were killed and 2 hostages after almost 3 weeks of work, and the terror had finally ended. But hostage situations aren't the only way you could die nowadays, as plants could do the same thing for you. Let's learn a bit about it. These are some of the most poisonous and most brutal plants in all of history. First up is the suicide plant. Whilst not being deadly by itself, the effect of this plant drives people to ending their own lives to escape the unimaginable pain. The Gympie Gympie, also known as the suicide plant, is a rare plant only commonly found in Queensland in Australia. The leaves of the plant consist of thousands of small needles to break off and inject a neurotoxin in your skin, whilst activating your pain receptors at the exact same time. And if that wasn't bad enough, as a last you from the glorified torture machine, they actively prevent the pain receptors from being turned off. According to victims, the pain was quote like being burned by hot acid and electrocuted at the same time, whilst others mentioned the pain lasting around several months or so. One man used the plant as toilet paper before, and the pain was so insufferable that he drove himself to shoot himself in his own head. But moving on, here's a fun question for you. How long do you think blisters usually last for? If you said a week, you'd be correct. With this information in mind, it's easy to see why the giant hogweed is so terrifying. You see, the burns and blisters that this plant causes remain on your skin for up to 7 years. The plants grow up to 8 feet tall and is commonly found in northern and western Europe. But as bad as that is, the white snake root is even worse. Imagine you're drinking a cold glass of milk, just like you normally would. And except this time, imagine you die a few hours later. And now imagine this happening with 1,000 people at the same time. Well, we don't have to imagine this, as it actually happened in Midwest America in the 19th century. Because this plant is so deadly that people died from drinking the milk of the animals that ate this exact same plant. It contains a mix of compounds known as trematol, which gets its name from the trembling that it actually causes if you ingest it. And even though you'd need to eat 0.5 of your body weight for it to have serious effects, it was a huge issue in Midwest America during the 19th century. Mass amounts of people were dying, but no one really knew why, but as it turns out, livestock were eating tons of the snake root themselves. So when people drank the milk from said livestock, there was a huge likelihood of them dying simply because they drank milk from the animals that had touched the plants. This is actually how Abraham Lincoln's mother died in 1818. Eventually doctors figured this out and the plant was removed from areas with livestock, which is why milk sickness is almost unheard of nowadays. But although it might have been unheard of nowadays, the same couldn't be said for the manchineel plant. Otherwise known as Manzana de la Muerte, or Little Apple of Death, this little fellow was crowned as the most poisonous tree in the entire world. Found in the tropical parts of America, every part of the tree, from the bark to the sap, is highly toxic. The tree's fruits are the most harmful part though, with even the smallest bite being able to cause extreme agony followed by death. But don't think you'll be safe by not eating this plant, because as it turns out, even standing near it when it rains is dangerous. Imagine you're Mr. Beast, locked on an island for 7 days with no escape, and suddenly you're setting up camp underneath a tree that is very poisonous. Wait, Mr. Beast, why the f did you do that? When rain falls on the tree, it causes the sap to drip down, and if it comes in contact with your skin, it can easily cause your skin to burn and blister. But if you thought the suicide plant from earlier wasn't cool enough, well, say hello to the suicide tree. Unlike the Logan Paul video you're probably thinking of, this beautiful green blob of goodness can easily kill you by stopping your heart once ingested. Interestingly enough, it's often used in both homicide and suicides, to the point where approximately 1 person would be found dead from the plant per week in the Indian state of Kerala. Or on one specific YouTube video posted on December 2017. The plant is popular in homicide cases because it's difficult to detect in autopsies and its taste is easy to mask with strong spices. So now you know how to kill someone. Take this moment to subscribe and think, I guess the YouTube videos are useful for something. But although this video might be useful, imagine you're on vacation in South America and a man walks up to you and blows some powder on your face. You don't think much of it at the time, so you keep walking, but wake up a few hours later with no money in your bank and no recollection of what happened beforehand. Sounds scary, but this is actually a real scenario that often happens when people come in contact with the Brugmansia plant. It's a flowering plant that can be found all over the globe, but it's native to South America in particular. It gets its name from the shape of the trumpet-shaped flowers that hang from the tree, coming in a lovely range of colors such as white, orange, pink, and yellow. And to say the least, the plant can take you to a real interesting trip if ingested. There's a report recorded in Psychiatry and Clinical Neuroscience of a man who cut off his own tongue, followed by his down below, after drinking a single cup of Brugmansia tea. It's also known to be used by scammers in some countries to take advantage of tourists by turning them into zombies that empty their bank accounts and have no recollection of the events, where they usually deliver the poison by blowing it at the victim's face. But as horrible as it is, the belladonna is actually even worse because it's the most toxic plant found in the Eastern Hemisphere. You see, both of the leaves and berries on this plant are extremely toxic, and eating them will result in a long list of side effects, including blurred vision, dilated pupils, sensitivity to light, rashes, severe dry mouth, slurred speech, urination retention, constipation, confusion, hallucinations, convulsions. The list goes on. The berries pose a giant risk to the children as they look pretty tasty and apparently taste moderately sweet. But don't get too addicted to these because 5 of 10 of these suckers are enough to kill an actual adult, let alone a child. Oh yeah, and just one single leaf of the plant will also do the job, just so you know, for future reference. But in future, you should probably also note the aconite, which is also known as the wolfbane, is a plant from a buttercup family that contains large quantities of poison called alkaloid... What? Nuconatine? Yeah, whatever that is, which at one point was used by the people of Japan to make their arrows more deadly. For a more recent example of the use of this plant, we can look at Nazis in World War II. They used this plant to make their bullets more deadly. And I didn't study law in school, but to me that sounds like it isn't allowed, since they can't be doing that. But although they can't be doing that, the same could be said for castor oil. See, castor oil is a type of vegetable oil that comes from Ricinus communis. See, ricin, sometimes known as the infertile fig tree, is an African bush with a thick wood stem and crimson or dark leaves, and is frequently covered in ricin, a very powerful deadly white powder. The drug causes nausea, stomach cramps, vomiting, internal bleeding, and kidney failure. It works by interrupting the chemical mechanisms that keep cells alive, meaning they die and the organs gradually fail under death occurrence. 5 of these beans would be enough to kill an adult and 1 for a kid. You see, castor oil is actually derived from the seeds of this plant, and I suddenly got the urge to poison a small child. And although I might have the urge to poison a small child, sometimes they'll do it themselves with the rosary pea. You see, the rosary pea are shiny scarlet red seeds with a black spot. They have other less common variants which can be found all throughout Africa, Asia, and Australia. Just one of these seeds can be lethal to both children and adults, which is why it's mind-bending to see that these seeds are used in bracelets, jewelry, and kids' toys outside of the US. Like, how do you get away with that? But by far, the most common and worst one is tobacco. And just when you thought a badly drawn animation video wasn't going to give you a kick in the ass, we're gonna on you smokers. Or in other words, any dipshit that has a vape pen on them right now. You see, by sheer numbers, tobacco is the most deadly plant in existence, claiming over 8 million victims yearly. You see, tobacco is known to cause over 80 different forms of cancer, but its highly addictive chemicals keep people coming back like it's a soft blanket and a hot cup of chocolate. The fuck are you doing? But honestly, none of these compare in comparison to when the world almost ended. There have been a few times when the world was seconds away from being completely destroyed, but none of which were nearly as tense as this first story. The US was preparing plans to invade Cuba, with over 130 million of today's dollars being used to explore options to invade. Though of course the US isn't going to invade with no reason. Well, actually, no, I take that back. That does sound like something they would do. But at least they had somewhat of a reason. You see, before 1959, Cuba was run by a close friend of the USA, who ensured that American companies controlled much of the economy like sugar, tobacco, and tourism. But then out of nowhere, a random dude's neurons activated and he realized that their country looked like a complete dumbass who were getting completely bullied by the US. That guy's name was Fidel Castro, and he got the world to the closest it's ever been to nuclear war. Fidel started a revolution that got him in total control of Cuba, and the US did not like that one bit. That's because Fidel began redistributing land, taking over American businesses, where he pretty much did whatever he could do to just piss off American elites. But this didn't really concern Eisenhower, who at the time was the US president. I mean, screw those guys anyway. But what really got him mad was the fact that Fidel Castro turned Cuba into a communist country, which at the time, America was no. So after a bunch of smaller missions to kill Fidel failed, the green light was given for a massive invasion. But newly elected President Kennedy wasn't to keep America's involvement a secret, because it would not be fun trying to explain to the public why you're rigging another country's politics. Wait a minute. So instead of sending US troops, they sent Cuban exiles. And it went as poorly as you could probably imagine. Once a makeshift army landed, people on the island completely dropped what they were doing and happily danced with the exiles into the government buildings, as they declared themselves overthrown. At least that's what the CIA were hoping for. But in reality, when the exiles arrived and were shouting at the people to join them in their rebellion, people were mostly confused and upset, since they didn't like how things were being run currently. And it didn't help that over 20,000 troops were waiting to murder the exiles, since the government had been tipped off about the possible invasion. The invasion flopped pretty bad, since over 100 invaders were killed and thousands more were captured, which only made Castro's position stronger, since he now claimed the US was out to get him. This led to Cuba getting pretty much closer with Russia and asking for more support, which they got in the form of a bunch of nukes that they were planning to install on the island. They did this as a way to protect the island, and also a way to counter the nukes of the US that they had placed in Italy and Turkey. And by this time, the US eventually figured out that the materials for the nukes were already in place. So they had to act fast to prevent nukes from getting into the island, which is when things got a whole lot more serious. But while the American government was debating on what to do, the Russians were busy setting up their own nukes. They only worked at night and put camouflage on the nukes during the day so they wouldn't be spotted. And in just over a week, the nukes would be active. It would be the biggest strategic victory in Russian history. And the US now had to act even faster, because if the Russians finished setting up, things would get a lot more serious. Several ideas came out at meetings, but the two main ideas stuck with the team. The first idea came from a very high military commander, Curtis LeMay. And just to give you an idea of who this guy really is, this is the same guy that helped drop the nukes in Japan. So make of that as you will. His idea is to have an air fleet bomb every single launch site in Cuba and launch a full-scale invasion at the same time. This would cost the lives of a lot of people, but with just few days to prep, it could mean that the conflict would be over in less than a week. A lot of the military advisors actually agreed with this idea, but all the non-military people were absolutely horrified by the idea, including President Kennedy. So they brought up a second plan. They wanted to put the US Navy all around Cuba to intercept any shipments going into Cuba, in hopes of catching these nukes. And while it might have sounded better on paper, it turned out a whole lot worse when they probably thought it would have. You see, on October 22nd, Kennedy announced that the US Navy would intercept all shipments coming to Cuba. But there was one slight problem with that, which is the naval blockade is considered an act of war, even though Kennedy claimed it was just a quarantine measure. The Russians still didn't appreciate this either, as one of the highest commanders in the Soviet Union wrote this letter to Kennedy stating, "The violation of freedom to use international waters in international airspace is an act of aggression, which pushes mankind toward the abyss of world nuclear war." Pretty poetic for a guy who barely speaks English, huh? Also, why did I sound Italian? I just realized that. And this letter started the most heated and tense 6-day battle in all of human history. The US pushed very hard to get Cuba and the Soviet Union to remove the missiles, but the communists claimed that they were only defensive. After this, the US put its nuclear force on what was called DEFCON 2, which is the closest the US ever got to launching nukes, as it's the only time DEFCON 2 has ever been used at all. One step closer, we would have been playing Fallout IRL, since DEFCON 1 means the apocalypse is actually happening. Just to point out how insane that is, after the Ukraine war broke out, the US went up to DEFCON 3, which has only happened 3 times after 1970. But even though tensions were at a literal all-time high, Russian ships knew about the blockade and departed from the Soviet Union to Cuba, ready for war. The US gave radio warnings to turn back, and if any ship refuses these warnings, a single warning shot would be fired at them. If they refuse to turn back, US ships are authorized to absolutely annihilate any ship with gunfire, sinking them. Still, a few hundred miles out, the Soviets seemed to not care about any of these warnings as they kept cruising towards Cuba. This kept going for a few days as the ships were getting closer and closer until they were approached to the quarantine zone. They refused all orders to turn back so far, and the US were getting their battle stations ready to engage in combat. But at the last minute, the ships just turned around. Well, almost all of them did. A single oil tanker refused to turn around and was slowly but surely approaching the quarantine zone. They only had hours to decide what to do with the ships. Officers were then ordered to not shoot at the ships without direct orders from President Kennedy, as sinking it would begin the biggest war in human history. Kennedy himself was informed on the ship, and his advisors explained that they had to let the ship go through. It might encourage more ships to do so, the same as the US looked weak, but if they shot it down, it would mean the end of the world. They were quickly running out of time to decide, and when Kennedy finally ordered the troops to let the ships dock in Cuba, this is only the first close call they actually had. However, the following day, Fidel sends the Russian government a letter telling them to launch nuclear missiles at the US. This guy was willing to sacrifice his land, his people, basically the rest of the world if it meant the US would burn with them. The Russians didn't really get much time to think about it though, as it might have been the stupidest thing they've read in a very long time. Like seriously, this guy was just insane. But the letter did give the Russian leader the idea to write one of his own to Kennedy. So he quickly wrote a letter explaining that he wanted to find peaceful solutions with the US so the world wouldn't reset to the Stone Age. There were a few problems with this though. Since the letter got leaked, Russian leaders Nikita Khrushchev would look weak to its citizens and allies. But if Kennedy agreed with the letter and it all turned out to be a trick, he would look pretty naive. They didn't have much time to talk about the letter though, as one of the following days, the first casualties of this conflict would happen. The US had been flying all over Cuba to keep track of nukes, but by this time it was detected by Cuban radars. In theory, they couldn't really do much though, as the missiles themselves were owned by the Soviet Union, and they were under very clear instructions not to fire anything without the approval of Kremlin. And since they obviously didn't want to start the last war to ever happen, they stood down and didn't shoot. Nah, I'm just kidding. The Russian guys later shouted at his men to take the plane down. So within minutes, a missile was launched at the U-2 spy plane. It was hit in the rear, and shrapnel from the impact killed the pilot. Before the plane even left the ground, the White House decided that if it was shot down, the two sides wouldn't even talk, and instead the military response would be immediately launched. The only issue is that the Americans didn't know what the Soviet Union had set up in their nuclear arsenal and was ready to fire it, instantly ending all American invasion. Luckily for us, the Americans didn't actually end up doing anything like they said they would, and instead offered to have a nice chat about the situation. But while the Americans were discussing what to do, yet another incident was about to happen and start World War III. Soviet subs had been detected near the Caribbean, and now one of them was coming near the quarantine zone. The US dropped depth charges in the sub in order to warn it to come up. But the submarines saw this as an act of war, and because of how deep they were in the water, they had no way to communicate with Moscow. So a lot of the high officers on board agreed that the war had broken out and they were about to prepare to launch a nuke. To do this, however, they needed the approval of 3 senior officers on board. The first 2 agreed, so all that was standing between the end of the world was the opinion of one single man. He began to sweat and thought about it for a while, and luckily he chose not to launch the nuke. And after this incident, the 2 countries made an agreement. Russia would remove its nukes from Cuba if the US removed theirs from Turkey. The agreement was broadcast live, and after a few long intense weeks, the issue was finally resolved. And something that wasn't fully resolved was actually some times where people were wanted on the FBI list and actually escaped. Imagine escaping jail with a key you made out of scrap metal, then robbing a bank and fleeing in a stolen plane. It sounds like a movie, right? Well, that's exactly what Frank Sprenz did in 1958, but his high-flying crime spree didn't end so well. But Sprenz wasn't the only criminal who shocked the world with his daring escapes that made him one of the most wanted people in the world. Let me tell you about Colton Harris Moore, aka the Barefoot Bandit. This guy started his crime spree when he was just a teenager and became one of the FBI's most wanted teenagers ever. For 2 whole years, Moore went on a wild ride across the US and Canada, but he didn't just steal cars or boats. This guy would steal real-life planes. And here's the crazy part, he taught himself how to fly planes only using manuals and flying simulators. People couldn't get enough of Moore's story, so some even saw him as a modern-day Robin Hood. It's like they forgot he was, actually breaking the law. But all good things must come to an end, right? Well, Moore's adventure came to a dramatic finish in the Bahamas after a high-speed boat chase that ended his run from the FBI's most wanted list. And it only gets worse from here. Because if you thought stealing planes was wild, wait till you hear about this guy who used an anti-tank gun to rob a bank. That's right, you heard me correctly. An anti-tank gun. This is a real-life story of Joel Singer and his uncle who pulled off one of the most audacious heists in FBI history and landed themselves on the wanted list. Picture this, it's October 25th, 1965, and Joel Singer is about to make his mark on the criminal world. But he's not your average bank robber. No. Singer had a different idea of what breaking and entering meant. Instead of using lockpicks and ski masks, his toolkits included drills, blowtorches, whatever that word is spelled. And here's the kicker, a friendly anti-tank gun. And you're probably wondering, how on earth do you get your hands on an anti-tank gun? Well, it turns out getting military-grade weapons was easier than you think back then. Singer simply walked into an arms manufacturer in Alexandria, Virginia, and bought it. Legally. But here's where Singer's criminal genius actually shines. After buying a gun he reported as stolen from himself to cover his tracks. And when the FBI first caught wind of the heist, they thought they were dealing with a terrorist plot. I mean, who uses an anti-tank gun for a robbery? The feds were left scratching their heads trying to figure out what kind of criminal mastermind they were up against. As Singer and his uncle managed to break into the Brinks security vault and make off with $423,000, it might not have sounded like much. But in today's money, that's a small loan of about $3.3 million. Not too shabby for a day's work, right? But as they say, crime doesn't pay, or at least not for long. After the heist, Singer and his uncle tried to cover their tracks by dumping the anti-tank gun in the New York harbor. But this is where things started to unravel for the criminal duo. Singer's uncle got nabbed pretty quickly, and like many partners in crime, he just told the FBI everything. Suddenly, the FBI had all the details of their ingenious plot. And let me tell you, they weren't impressed by Singer's creativity. They were out for blood. On November 1st of 1965, just days after the robbery, Joel Singer found himself on the FBI's most wanted list. Now, you might be thinking that the FBI's most wanted list would buy you some time to enjoy your ill-gotten gains, right? Maybe sip some pina coladas on a beach somewhere. Well, not for Joel Singer. In a twist that would make even the most optimistic criminal lose hope, Singer's freedom lasted a total of 10 days. That's right, just a week and a half after making the FBI's hit list, Singer was in cuffs, and it turns out even the craftiest of criminals can't outrun the law forever. The FBI teamed up with the Canadian law enforcement in a joint operation that would make any buddy cop movie proud. And just like that, Singer's criminal career just came to an abrupt end. After all that planning and all of the risk, how much money do you think stolen was actually recovered? A total of a whopping $188. That's it. All the efforts for less than 200 bucks. It's almost enough to make you feel sorry for the guy. But remember Frank Sprenz I mentioned earlier? Well, his story is even crazier than you might think. This guy started his criminal career when he was just 11 years old. That's right. Whilst most kids were playing with toys, Sprenz was already getting into trouble with the law. But Sprenz really made a name for himself in 1958 when he pulled off one of the most incredible prison breaks ever. Picture this, Sprenz is locked in a Summit County jail in Akron, Ohio. Most people would just sit there and serve their time. But not our guy Frank, he's got other plans. Using none other than scrap metal he found lying around, Sprenz crafted a homemade skeleton key, and now this wasn't any flimsy piece of metal. This key was so well made that it not only freed Sprenz, but also 4 of his inmate friends. It's like he was running his old jailbreak service. Once he was out, Sprenz didn't exactly lay low. Instead, he went on a 1-year-long crime spree, which would even make some of the most daring criminals jealous. He robbed a bank in Hamilton, Ohio, which is pretty standard criminal stuff, but here's where it gets wild. Instead of using a getaway car like a normal bank robber, Sprenz decided it was time to up the ante, where he stole a plane and flew it away from the bank. Now you might be thinking, surely this is where he gets caught, right? Wrong. Sprenz managed to evade capture for an entire year. He was like the real-life version of Tom Cruise and Top Gun Maverick. His exploits were so audacious that they caught the attention of none other than J. Edgar Hoover himself. That's right, the big boss of the FBI took a personal interest in catching Sprenz, landing Sprenz near the top of the FBI's most wanted list. Hoover launched a massive manhunt to catch Sprenz, and it was like a game of cat and mouse, with Sprenz somehow always managed to slip away just in time. The FBI was pulling out all the stops, but Sprenz was proving to be one slippery customer. But as they say, all good things must come to an end, as Sprenz's luck finally ran out in 1959, where he crash-landed a stolen plane into Cozumel, Mexico. Can you imagine the scene? This guy who'd been outsmarting the FBI for years was brought down by his own piloting? That's rough. After his capture, Sprenz was shipped off to the most infamous prison in America, Alcatraz. Now you'd think being locked up in The Rock would end up putting a stop in Sprenz's criminal career, right? Well, not exactly. In a twist of things that nobody saw coming, Sprenz decided to use his time in Alcatraz to study calculus and make art. That's right, this master escape artist turned out into a math whiz and ended up making art behind bars. He was drawing cartoons and paintings like he was in some kind of bizarre art school instead of a maximum security prison. It's almost like Sprenz was trying to reinvent himself. One day he's robbing banks and flying planes, and then the next he's solving complex equations and creating masterpieces. Despite all of doing this in prison, Sprenz just couldn't seem to keep his foot out the door of crime. Even after his release, he kept getting into trouble with the law right up to his death in 2016 when he was killed by a cow. Wait, it turns out that Sprenz was taking off in a stolen plane and he ended up swerving to avoid hitting a cow, and it ended up killing him. Anticlimactic, I know. But before I continue, I'd like to ask if you could subscribe. You're like 6 minutes into this video already, so you're obviously enjoying it, so it would mean so much. Now, you might think we've seen it all when it comes to criminals outsmarting the law, but just wait until you hear about Donald Eugene Webb. This guy wasn't your average crook. He was a ghostly gangster who managed to haunt the FBI's most wanted list for decades. Born in 1931 in Oklahoma, Webb wasn't content with a simple life of crime. No, he had to go big or go home. He became a skilled burglar and bank robber, but that wasn't enough. Webb decided to level up his crime career by cozying up with the Patriarca crime family. But Webb's life of crime took a deadly turn in December 4th of 1980. What should have been a routine traffic stop turned into a nightmare when Webb allegedly murdered police chief Gregory Adams. But this wasn't just any murder. No. Adams was beaten severely and then shot twice at close range. It was a shocking act of violence that catapulted Webb straight to the top of the FBI's most wanted list. Now, you'd think that being one of America's most wanted criminals would make it hard to stay hidden, right? Well, Webb had a few tricks up his sleeve. His connections to organized crime weren't just for show. They provided him with a network of safe houses and resources that kept him one step ahead of the law for years. The FBI launched a massive manhunt, but Webb seemed to have vanished into thin air. It was like trying to catch a ghost. The sightings of Webb were reportedly all over the country, but every time the authorities thought they were close, he'd slip through their fingers like smoke. And years would turn into decades, and still Webb remained at large. Every lead went cold, and every trail that they went along was ran dry. But here's where the story takes a twist that even the best crime novelists couldn't even dream of. In 2017, after 37 years on the run, the mystery of Donald Eugene Webb was finally solved. And the solution? It was buried in his ex-wife's garden. That's right, Webb's former wife, Lillian, dropped a bombshell on investigators. She revealed that Webb had actually died in 1999 from a stroke, and where was his body? Buried right there in her backyard in Dartmouth, Massachusetts. After decades of searching, the answer was literally 6 feet under all along. And on June 20th, 2017, investigators dug up Webb's remains, putting an end to one of the longest running manhunts in FBI history. It wasn't just a shocking discovery though, as it rewrote the entire story. All those years while the FBI were chasing ghosts, Webb was just dead. But if you think a crime family was impressive, wait till you hear about Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. This guy just didn't steal planes. He built an entire drug empire around it. Born into poverty in rural Mexico, El Chapo rose to become one of the most powerful drug lords in history. It was like rags to riches stories, except only with more guns and cocaine. El Chapo co-founded the Sinaloa cartel in the late 1980s. And let me tell you, this wasn't your average neighborhood drug ring. These guys took drug trafficking to a whole new level. We're talking the sophisticated distribution networks that would make Amazon jealous. The Sinaloa cartel was moving mind-boggling amounts of cocaine, meth, marijuana, heroin all across America and beyond. It's like they were like a frequent flyer program for drugs. But here's where El Chapo's story gets really wild. In 2001, he pulled off an escape that would make Houdini proud. Picture this, El Chapo's chilling in a maximum security prison, probably planning his next big shipment. But instead of sitting there, he decided to make a break for it. And how did he do it? He hid in a laundry cart. That's right, the most wanted man in Mexico escaped in something you'd use to carry your dirty socks. You think after that El Chapo would lay low, right? Maybe retire to a nice beach somewhere. Nope. He goes right back to running his drug empire. For over a decade, he's out there living his kingpin life while the authorities are tearing up their hair trying to find him. Fast forward to 2014 and they finally catch up to him. Game over, right? Well, no. El Chapo had more tricks up his sleeve, and it was a doozy. In 2015, El Chapo pulled off an escape so audacious, it makes the laundry cart trick look like child's play. Imagine you're in a maximum security prison. There are guards everywhere, cameras watching your every move. How do you get out? Through the front door? Nah, it's too obvious. Not if you're El Chapo. You go down. El Chapo's associates dug a tunnel, but not just any tunnel, mind you. We're talking a mile-long, fully ventilated, well-lit underground passage that led right into his cell. It's like something out of a James Bond movie, only real. The tunnels even had a motorcycle on rails to speed up the escape. I mean, who thinks of this stuff really? Well, El Chapo apparently. So picture this. 1 minute El Chapo's in a cell, probably doing push-ups or whatever drug lords do in their free time. And the next minute, poof, he's just gone. Not even El Chapo's luck could last forever though. As in January 2016, the authorities finally caught up to him in Los Mochis, Sinaloa. And this time, they weren't taking any chances. No more security prisons or El Chapo. Nope, they just shipped him off to the good old US of A. In 2017, El Chapo found himself in New York courtrooms facing a laundry list of charges that would make even the most hardened criminals sweat. We're talking drug trafficking, organized crime, the whole 9 yards. It was like the greatest hits album of criminal activities. Just try was something like it was out of a crime thriller, and by the time all of his old associates were finished ratting him out, El Chapo's reputation was in tatters. But you know whose reputation was even worse? The Branch Davidians. Now hear me out. Nothing goes quite together like an extremely religious pedophile group that have guns and the government. I'm talking about the Branch Davidians here. This group's beliefs started a siege that lasted weeks, and it's known as one of the most horrific and shameful sieges in all of modern history. And it was that bad that it led to the greatest shootout since the Cold War. Now, these guys were pretty damn weird, starting with the fact that they were religious to the point that they believed their leader was the final prophet and the apocalypse would come very soon. And what do people do when they believe their freedom is in question? If you said drink unlimited booze and eat chocolate till you throw up, you'd be kind of close, but not so true. Instead, these guys started stockpiling everything they could get their hands on that could kill someone. I'm talking pistols, rifles, grenades, and an ungodly amount of ammunition that would even make the US Army jealous. And in America, you could get away with a lot. But these guys were buying guns to the point where even the weapons dealers and the FBI were like, well, you guys gotta chill there. And if there's one thing a group likes more than guns, it's marrying people. Young people. The group's leader, David Koresh, thought about marrying a single person and thought, screw that. And instead, he just told everyone that he'd been given divine permissions to make multiple wives out of people. Which in itself really isn't that harmful. I mean, whatever floats your boat. But the sad part is where the fact that several of these wives were as young as 12 to 14. He also had children with many of these, well, you know, which launched an investigation by the government. He claimed to not have these young wives for any explicit reasons, but instead so he could build a new lineage known as the House of David, which sounds like either a bad reality TV show or a gambling game. You see, living in the compound was also very strict. Almost everything was done with a schedule like praying, eating, and doing chores, of which a lot were about growing food, since the compound was almost entirely self-sustained. Some people in the compound didn't even really agree with David's teachings, so there was always some sort of tension in the compound, even when there was no active threat. These guys also had their fair share of violence before the government even stepped in. Like when the predicted apocalypse was supposed to happen, most of the group just sold everything they had and built a few shacks and tents near the best site to survive in. But when the supposed doomsday arrived, nothing happened. Obviously, this led to a bunch of mad people dying, new people taking control, you get the idea. The group then split into two groups, which both believed in the same idea, but just thought of the other one as kind of annoying. The leader of these groups then challenged each other for the resurrection contest, which is as stupid as it sounds, as the police stepped in claiming they were abusing the corpse. This started the beef between the two groups and the police, but the main conflict itself started on February 28th of 1993. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, also called the ATF, were planning on invading the compound to arrest its leader, David Koresh. But if anything, this raid showed how bad the government was at their job. It was really bad. You're gonna see soon. You see, plans about this raid were actually leaked before they were even finalized, so when the ATF expected no one to know about the compound, they all kind of knew. And it didn't help that they themselves invited media to come and watch the spectacle that was about to unfold. The ATF set up their weapons and they patiently waited for the order to execute the search warrant. David said that he was willing to talk to the agents, so both groups started preparing for the worst, especially when David was getting ready to go outside. David opened the door, but right before he could walk outside, shots started being fired throughout the area. David then sprinted back inside and ordered his followers to open fire at the agents. To this day, no one knows exactly who fired the first shot, as both groups said the other ones did it. But some people even claimed that shots were fired by the so-called dog team, which was sent to kill all the animals in the branch kennel, which is just horrible. But that didn't even matter in the moment. They just started a massive war that would last weeks and cost the lives of tens if not hundreds of people. Agents surrounded the entire building and began climbing up ladders to the roof in order to reach the compound's gun room. While making their way to the roof, several officers were shot and killed by the Branch Davidians, and one was just wounded, just barely being able to crawl back to the ladder for safety. And then they started throwing stun grenades inside before entering the room. When one more agent tried to climb up, he was hit by a lot of enemy fire, which unfortunately killed him. The agents had now successfully entered the armory, where they took out one of the Branch Davidians using a shotgun to the face. But when return fire hit one of the officers, he was killed. At this point, the officers were starting to get surrounded by the enemies, and it was only a matter of time until they would be too late to survive from them. They either had to try to surrender or risk making a push for survival. Gunshots were still being fired around them at all times, as the agents outside could only wait for what was going to happen. The officers jumped up, killed a Branch Davidian, and started running to escape. Two of the officers were wounded during the escape, while the third officer returned fire, killing one of the people inside. They then made one final push to the exit, where the third officer was hit in the head with a wooden beam that came falling from the roof. They managed to escape the building with help of an officer who started firing at the people still inside. And right when the trapped officer made it to safety, the officer outside was shot and killed instantly, mainly by the enemies inside. This marked the end of the main assault, which lasted roughly 45 minutes. And at this point, the agents began to run out of ammo. In total, the shooting lasted around 2 hours, where a ceasefire was finally negotiated after 4 officers were killed, as well as 5 Branch Davidians. And after the embarrassing performance from the drug police, the big boys decided to step in. We're talking FBI level here. For starters, the FBI themselves offered to establish contact with David and others inside, which they agreed to. And it looked like things were already going a lot better than when it started. And it also eased the tension on both sides as they were dealing with casualties here. The case was handed to Hostage Rescue Team Commander Rich Rogers, who had been previously criticized for his actions at Ruby Ridge, but they would later see that the Waco incident was 100 times worse than the last one. As his second move in commandment, Richard overrode the site commander at Waco and ordered the blue and gold HRT teams to the same site, which might not sound weird at first, but this created a lot of pressure to resolve the situation one way or another, since the HRT teams didn't really have enough reserves to keep the teams at the same site for long enough. So to speed things up, the FBI started using psychological warfare on the people in the compound. And these back and forward conversations of trying to get hostages out of the building, like for example children, lasted for like weeks. And when I mean weeks, it was like a tense few weeks. They tried pretty much everything at a certain point. We're talking manipulation, pretty much anything you probably think of. Like for example, blasting gruesome sounds of bunnies being slaughtered and using extremely bright lights at night to keep those inside awake. While the FBI was busy doing FBI things, David was staying in contact with the local news as he gave phone interviews and updates on the situation. But then out of nowhere, the FBI decided that screw that and straight up cut all contact between the compound and the outside world. Mainly because of negotiations and how the only reason David was allowed to do that in the first place was so that he would release hostages. And when David didn't release those hostages, it was pointless letting him keep those communications because that's what they wanted to cut off in the first place. This meant that there was no way for David and his followers to talk to anyone except the 25 FBI negotiators. In a later interview, it showed that negotiators criticized the commanders for cutting off negotiations and pretty much just making sure that all situations would end peacefully, which they were very successful at, well, mostly. In the following few days, tensions were still high around Waco, and neither side seemed to be willing to comply until the FBI believed they would finally make a breakthrough. David's goal was to show the entire world his message, so one of the FBI's negotiators, Agent Noser, wanted to use that to his advantage. The plan was for David to record a message which would be broadcasted on national television, and in return for that, he as well as the other Branch Davidians would peacefully surrender to the cops. The broadcast was made and then the FBI waited nervously for signs of movement in the compound. This could be the best chance to end the situation before it gets any way serious. And all it would take would be David to walk through the front door and finally the situation was over. Oh wait, no it's not? Oh. No, he didn't walk out the door in the end. Apparently, God told David to stay in the building and wait. But even with this hiccup, the FBI still managed to negotiate the release of 19 children, which were both between a few months to 12 years old. The parents, however, were still in the building, actually 98 to be fact, and the children were interviewed by the FBI and allegedly they had been physically and mentally abused long before the standoff. This started the biggest conflict of the entire event, as on April 19th, 9 Bradley tanks carrying tear gas grenades made it to the compound. The tanks then started driving across and crushing pretty much everything they could find, like fences and cars belonging to the Davidians. The Davidians were getting pretty upset with the FBI and even the negotiators were getting mad at them for doing horrible jobs. And the main assault then started when tanks made holes in the building and started pouring tear gas inside to lure the Davidians out. The FBI had planted listening devices at this point and they were hearing conversations inside the compound like, have they poured it yet? And don't pour it all out, we need some later. It was suspected they were talking about fuel which they were planning to blow up the compound with. But then it seemed like someone was finally surrendering. He walked outside, but right before surrendering, he threw away his phone and sprinted back in. And at this point, the entire building was gassed, yet no one came out. More conversations were being held from inside the compound, and this time it seemed clear they were talking about setting themselves on fire. The fuel has to go all around to get started. Many more tear gas rounds were being shot into the building now, but it didn't seem like anyone was leaving. Shortly after this, however, a banner appeared saying the Davidians wanted their phones fixed. It seemed like they were finally willing to talk to the FBI about surrendering, but this is not what the government claims. Instead, they claim things were being said like, I want a fire and keep that fire going. And the fire, they got. Signs of smoke were starting to come out of the building, and shortly after, the entire thing burst into flames. There was no way to save those still inside, even though fire trucks were still arriving. At this point, almost 100 people, including more than 20 children, died, and this finally marked the end of the standoff as David Koresh was pronounced dead. If you want more information on this, there's actually a full documentary on Netflix, which is really good. So if you want to watch that, go ahead. And if not, and you want to keep watching some videos, watch our ones. It's on screen right now. They're pretty good, pretty funny. Right, bye-bye.